Hello, and welcome to the vocabulary breakdown of the first podcast. So, Fluency Mastery 101 podcast, lesson one, food delivery services. In these videos, I'm going to essentially explain and kind of give a more in-depth analysis on how we use different words, what they mean, and basically what are the different applications of it. So, why don't we get started with our first word, convenient. So, convenient just means to say something that is very suitable to your situation. So, for instance, you would use this word to explain things like such as if something fits with your schedule, for instance, then you would definitely say, oh, this is a very convenient time for me. You would use this especially in any kind of conversation, whether you are making plans with friends, making plans with family, or especially with work. Perhaps your boss might ask you to come into a specific time, and you might tell them, oh, whether it is convenient or it is or inconvenient, which is the opposite. The next word we have is uptick. Now, this is not really used in general conversation. However, this is used in more statistics because the word uptick just means an increase in something, and you would use this when you're describing statistics. So, for example, in the discussion, when we used uptick, it just means that we're talking about the statistics in which this group of people, we now see an uptick or an increase because of recorded statistics. So that would be essentially, it's more specifically related to statistics in that case. The next word we used was treat. So there are two ways to understand it, but the way that we used it in this case was as a noun rather than a verb. So a treat, very simply put, is just a very small reward. So for example, let's say you give yourself a very let's say you do something, it could be as minuscule or as small as like doing a long list of chores, or maybe you had to do a project or something, whether it's for career or school related. Now, what you can do with this is you could just say, oh, I give myself a little treat. Why? Because you give yourself a little reward. Culturally, we do associate treat with food, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like food. It could even just be as simple as um, just you take yourself to the park, or you take like a not a full vacation, but rather perhaps a little mini vacation. Maybe you go to the city next to you, for instance. These are the ways that we can say a treat, and it's used in everyday conversation, so it's not really specific to one thing. Now, the next word that we used was dystopian. Now, dystopian is something that you would use in order to describe something that seems a little too much. What I mean by too much is, so for instance, let's say you see how society is developing, and if you think that there's something a little too demanding, for instance, from like the governments, or in general how people are thinking or acting, if it seems a little too far off in terms of what is right and what is wrong, we would regard that as the adjective dystopian. For example, if you have ever watched the Netflix series Black Mirror, each episode has a different form of a dystopian society. For instance, one episode would be that you live in like a very small, essentially the size of a closet, and advertisements are displayed everywhere, and the only thing you do is run on a bike to generate money, essentially. We would say that's dystopian because that is pushing the boundaries of what we consider to be right and wrong. For instance, human beings were not meant to be in a small closet to almost 24 hours of the day. So that's how we use the word dystopian. Moving on to the next word, counterpart. This is very easy, and this can work for business or even general conversation. Counterpart just means the opposite. Just to keep it simple, it's like the opposite. So, for instance, when we talk about in the video, we talked about there's the millennials and Gen Xers, and then their counterpart, or their older, the older people. So, for example, millennials and counterparts, they're typically around the age of, like, at this point, it's like anywhere between the age of 20 and 30. That would be that group. The counterpart, or the opposite, would be those who are in their 40s and above, for instance. And that's very straightforward in that case. Moving on. Then we have the word disincentivize. So this word just means to kind of demotivate somebody from doing something. For example, a lot of businesses, because this is a word that you can use not only in the professional or formal conversation, but you can also use it in a daily, like an everyday conversation with somebody. For example, I would say, For instance, let's say there is some problem happening, right? Let's say, especially we could talk about if there is a lot of construction, then we say that that disincentivizes people driving. Why? Because construction would mean there's more traffic. More traffic means you will have to be stuck there for, and rather than driving through that street in 2 minutes, it'll probably take you at least triple that. So that, if anything, discourages you from using a car, and perhaps you use a bike or you use public transportation until they finish with the construction. So that's an example of how we use this word. The next word we used was curtail. Similar to the way we used uptick, which is more for statistics, curtail is the same idea where it's only focusing on looking at things from a statistical point of view, meaning, and so of course, if uptick is the increase, curtail is the decrease. So for instance, when we're talking about at the start of the pandemic, we would say that there is a curtail in terms of people going to the restaurants. And that is a statistic. That is fact that a lot of places had to shut down because of the pandemic. And so that's what we're just saying, that there is a decrease in this sense. Moving on, we also use the word taxing. Now, this one's very interesting because you would assume tax just necessarily means the money that you owe to the government and whatnot, but it doesn't necessarily mean it in this case. When we use it as a verb, taxing, it just means something that can basically wear you down. So for example, it can maybe make you lose interest over time. It could be, for instance, this can either be financial strain or even an emotional strain. It doesn't have to, it's not specifically related to money. It can be, but it expands beyond just that. So an example of taxing, we could say, like, for instance, let's say there are some people who are working 50 hours a week, for instance. We could say that this is very taxing on their mind. Why? Because they have to work so much. So it's over time, their brains kind of starts to get affected. They start to get tired. So we could definitely say that this is very taxing on them. The next word we used is slippery slope. So this is kind of like a phrase. And essentially, if you look at this word literally, it means a slope, or I guess another way we could think of it is like a cliff. So think of it as a cliff. A cliff, if it's slippery, you can easily fall down and cause, irreversible damage, for instance. However, instead of it taking it literally, a slippery slope just means that if you fall into, you can easily fall into the situation, and that situation can turn worse if you're not careful. That's all we mean. And we can use it to describe any situation. Sometimes we could use it in business, for instance. We could say that taking this risk is a slippery slope because if everything goes wrong, it's going to go wrong. So that is a way that we can use slippery slope, or an everyday conversation. If someone wants to, let's say they want to cook with something they have never tried before, that is also slippery slope because they involve the risk of maybe burning the food or perhaps even causing an accident that may hurt themselves or others. So that is the way we use slippery slope. The next word we used was premises. Now, in this case, the premises just refers to the boundary or the territory of some kind of place, especially that of a property and business. So, for example, think about whenever you go to any store. When you enter the store, when you are in that premises or in the boundaries of what is considered to be that store, for instance, whether how far out it is, or of course inside, premises just refers to just the boundary. So as long as you're within that boundary of that store, you must follow the rules that they give you. So if they say no food and drink, for example, that means that as long as you're within that boundary, that territory, you are not allowed to bring any sort of food. And now the next word is toxic. Now this one might be a little confusing because toxic you would assume means just poisonous, right? Something that can harm you, but not necessarily. So culturally, toxic just means something that can be harmful to your mental health. So something like, so for example, if let's say there is a person who is very abusive to somebody, that we will relate to as very toxic behavior. Why? Because in a way, it is a poison, not a literal poison, but rather it's something that kind of affects the mind of the person. It affects their emotional state. It affects their mental state. That's why we refer to this as toxic, because it is affecting in a very negative way. So, and of course, you could use it as a literal term, but in this case, it applies to, especially when we're talking about if a person is acting very horrible or abusive, etc. Now, the last word that we used today was bias. Now, bias can be used in many applications, especially in the political application. It could be used in that case. So, for instance, bias just means that you are already leaning to one side of a topic without even considering the opposite side. To keep the situation simple, think about it like this: in families where when there are two siblings, right? So, let's say two brothers or a brother and a sister. It does not matter. However, what we should really pay attention to is, let's say the parents already regard as one of the siblings as the good one, so that would already mean that the parents have some bias, meaning because they already assume that one of what the siblings is good, they are just always going to kind of believe that and not really consider that perhaps that the good sibling might have done something bad for once. And so that is biased, where your own opinions are affected to the point where you might not even be willing to accept others' sides. And again, this applies not only in the political arena, but also in the social arena, as in the example given. And that will cover all of the vocabulary we just covered. Thank you for tuning in to the podcast lesson or vocabulary summary of this, and we will see you next time. Take care.